Welcome to Kent Channel. This is the first time that we're going to provide a broadcast in English, and so I hope you can understand it. It's not really meant for Japanese people. Today I want to address my remarks to a group of American historians that I think have made a very bad mistake. I'm sure you have heard that McGraw-Hill recently published a textbook, and it included a passage written by a man named Ziegler and one other man about the comfort women issue during World War II. And it accused Japan of forcibly recruiting 200,000 women to serve as, quote, sex slaves, or the equivalent of that. And it had several other grave errors in it, about 8 big errors in it. And I won't go through all of those today because, I just want to say this. It's very clear that this is not an accurate portrayal of what happened. This is actually historical revisionism, and it's being pushed by some anti-Japanese forces. I use forces in sort of a general term, but there are some anti-Japanese groups in the United States that for some reason want to make it appear that Japan committed some great atrocities in the war, in World War II, which in fact it did not commit. And I'm not sure why they want to do this, but I think their ultimate goal is to weaken the Japanese-American Defense Alliance. That being said, anyway, the article was printed in the new McGraw-Hill textbooks, which have so far only been used in just a very few schools. The Japanese Foreign Ministry, of course, lodged a protest because this is a great affront to the Japanese national honor, and it also creates all kinds of international diplomatic problems which don't need to be had. And so now a group of 19 historians and a group of 19 historians published a protest saying that the Japanese government should not interfere in the content of textbooks. Well, you know, from a freedom of expression point of view, perhaps that's the case, perhaps it's not. But these historians need to be sure that if they want to defend this passage, that it's correct. And it is not correct. And it is very clear to me and to all of the rest of us who have studied this matter and who do understand the underlying facts that the passage is incorrect. So the fact that these people are defending the passage indicates to me that they have not looked at the evidence. Now, as a historian, I'm not a historian, but I have studied a lot of history and I know lots of historians, and I think most historians do not want to go down in history as having propagated false history. Okay? Now, let me just give some background here. The Japanese, of course, they annexed Korea in the early 1900s, and during World War II, there was a war. They were at war with China and a whole bunch of other people. The allegation is that during World War II, the Japanese army forcibly conscripted 200,000 women, mostly from Korea and China, aged 14 to 20, to serve as what is euphemistically called comfort women, but is actually just prostitutes or camp followers. And but the article further states that these people were virtual sex slaves, that they were forced to work against their will, and that if they tried to escape, they were beat up. And that many of them were killed. Now, everything I just said has no historical basis. In the first place, there is no evidence that the Japanese army forcibly conscripted comfort women. Some of these anti-Japanese groups that I talked about in the United States actually had the United States of America itself conduct a huge survey of all the government records including the CIA, the FBI, the military. It took 7 years, and they published a report, cost $30 million of American taxpayer money, and the report said that there is not one bit of evidence that that occurred. The only reason this issue ever came up anyway is because of it started in the 1980s. If you'll recall, Japan and Korea concluded a treaty after the war, basic treaty, and that was in 1965. At that time, nobody said anything about comfort women. And I should point out here that the existence of comfort women is almost universal in all theaters of every war. It's not illegal. It's not against international war law. And at the time, prostitution itself was legal. Now, I wouldn't say that most prostitutes necessarily really wanted to be that, but they may have been they may have had to do it because of economic circumstances, or there may be family reasons or whatever. But the idea that Japan actually went out and rounded up by force, kidnapped these women and made them serve as sex slaves is simply not supported by any fact at all. The only reason anybody thinks that might have happened is because a guy named Yoshida published a novel in which he claimed that that was the case. And the Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun picked that up and wrote a series of articles claiming that that was true. None of those articles have been corroborated, and neither has the contents of the novel, which, by the way, is a work of fiction, not nonfiction. And in fact, last year, Asahi was forced to retract all of those things, which they did very grudgingly, but they did. To their credit, they did retract all of the articles about that. The second thing about the 200,000 number, to believe that 200,000 would be necessary is ridiculous. Japanese only had probably between 1 and 1.7 million soldiers. Well, they only had 4 million altogether in the whole world, in every theater of war. So there were probably only between 1 and 1.7 million in all of Korea and China. It doesn't take 200,000 prostitutes to service 1.7 million men. If you divide it, and not only that, some people have argued that they had to serve 20, 30, or 40 men a day. If you divide that out, that comes to 6 times of sexual intercourse every day for every soldier to make that number work. That's impossible. In the first place, these people are fighting a war and not carrying on an orgy, for heaven's sake. And not only that, it's not free. These soldiers had to pay for the sexual favors, and they had very low wages. They would use up their entire monthly wage in 2 or 3 days if they were doing that kind of thing. It's just preposterous. It's simply preposterous. What I'd like to say here is you historians really need to get your act together. You need to go back and look at the evidence, and you need to keep an open mind and not be influenced by these agitators who are trying to revise history. This simply didn't happen, okay? It just didn't happen, and unless you can find some evidence that it did, then you should not be lending your name to an inaccurate depiction of what a nation did during a war. And most certainly this should not be taught to young people. Young people should not be taught false things in a school or in a history textbook. So I suggest that you get busy and go back and research this. And if you can find the evidence, then fine. But if not, I think you really need to remove your name from that endorsement of the article and perhaps publish just the opposite, that you most certainly do not endorse the article. And maybe that way you can save your own reputation for future generations. Thank you. Hi, welcome to Kent Channel. Today I want to talk about the War Guilt Information Program. This may be something you've never heard of, and so I'll explain it to you. At the end of World War II, during the last stages of the war, there were some very fierce battles, and the Americans really were afraid of the Japanese. They were afraid that when the war ended, Japan would not properly capitulate, and then it would be very difficult to bring this country under control. So when Japan did surrender, MacArthur came in and he set up the Supreme Allied powers set up this organization to administer Japan. It's called GHQ, General Headquarters, and it was headed by General MacArthur. And of course, the war ended on, theoretically it ended on August 15th, and by early September they had put into place a war guilt information program. One of the biggest parts of that was a press code, where all of the members of the press, that means the printed press and also the broadcast press, which, however, there was not any television at the time, so we're talking mainly radio. All of these people were to adhere to 30 rules. And I will just tell you what these rules were. First of all, no criticism of GHQ, and no criticism of the Tokyo War Crimes trial. Absolutely no criticism of the fact that GHQ wrote the new Constitution, and no mention of the fact that there is this censorship system. Of course, everything published had to be run through the censors first, and they were looking at something like 5,000 pieces of information each day that had to be cleared through the censors. But to even discuss that system was in place was against the rules. And you were not to criticize the following countries: America, Russia, England or the UK, Korea, China, or any of the other Allied powers, or at all. You couldn't criticize any of these people at all. And there was to be no discussion of how the Japanese were treated in Manchuria after the war. And as you know, a lot of those people were held against their will and used for forced labor, but that was not to be discussed or not to be criticized. You couldn't criticize the policies of the Allied powers before the war. As you know, there's a strong feeling among many people that the Americans actually drove Japanese to war because of their economic policies, where they put in place this almost bulletproof blockade all the way around Japan so that Japan couldn't get any fuel or food. Not to give the impression that World War III might be coming. I'm glad to hear that. No discussion of the Cold War. No discussion of Japan as a holy country, or nationalism, or the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as they called it in those days. That is not to be discussed. That was Japan's plan to kind of decolonize the whole Far East. Couldn't discuss that. No other advertising. I don't know what that means. I guess it means whatever the censors don't want to have advertised. No trying to justify any of the people who were convicted as war criminals. No justification and no discussion about the relations between American soldiers and Japanese women. Can't talk about that one. Okay. No discussion of black markets. Or the occupation troops, and you must not exaggerate claims of starvation, and no false reporting. I love that. All of the reporting ends up being false when it's run through a censor. So this is really hilarious. But anyway, no false reporting, and no inappropriate things about GHQ. And of course, no early disclosure of information which is not supposed to be disclosed, whatever that means. It's all up to the censors. So this was put in place, and it was immensely successful. This is basically an indoctrination or brainwashing campaign. And the purpose was to make the Japanese people submit and I wouldn't say necessarily become a peace-loving people, but at least they wouldn't be a warmongering people. That was the idea. It was wildly successful. The Japanese press followed the code, basically. The Asahi newspaper broke it a couple of times and got themselves, had their newspaper stopped a couple of times. But generally speaking, most people obeyed it. Problem is, they continue to obey it. And even now, there are lots of things that you cannot discuss on television or anywhere else, and or even in political debates. One of those taboos is the Constitution. For some reason, Japanese think, or a lot of Japanese, I would say even probably a majority of Japanese think that there's something sacred about that Constitution that they shouldn't discuss changing it. Now, I don't know any constitution in the world that's a perfect constitution, okay? And certainly not the Japanese Constitution. That was written by GHQ staff. It's not a bad constitution, but it's got a couple of problems in it. And I don't see any problem with discussing that now, but they don't like to do it. And to do so is somehow considered some kind of traitorous act. I don't understand that. But I think it stems from this press code. The press regularly refrains from criticizing either of the Koreas or China on some things that they really ought to be more critical about. They sort of dutifully cover the story, but they don't really dig in deep. I guess the one that they obey. The one that they disobey the most is about false reporting, because there's plenty of that goes on. And anyway, the point is, when you have a system like that in place, first of all, anything that you read or hear in the media, you can't believe. And the fact that that effect is still strong in the Japanese media makes the Japanese media less effective for formulating proper policy, and also less trustworthy. And you end up with things happening like when the Asahi newspaper published all those false reports about comfort women and such. There just isn't the oversight of the press that there ought to be, because they kind of I don't know, they just hold back and on some things, and then they go overboard on other things. The balance is not there. Anyway, it's all the Americans' fault. I guess that's the conclusion.